Welcome to 3Ps on a Pod, the Pisha podcast where you get to hear from the current, past, and future presidents of the Pennsylvania Speech Language and Hearing Association. I am Nicole Bilak, the current president of Pisha.
Hi everyone, I'm Craig Coleman, president-elect of Pisha. On this podcast, we'll bring you conversations about the challenges and opportunities in our field, highlight important updates, and share ideas that help professionals stay informed, connected, and supported.
And I'm Erin Buckwater, past president of Pisha. We'll also be talking with colleagues, leaders, and experts from across the state and beyond to share insights, experiences, and practical information that matters to our community. Let's get started.
Hello, Nicole Bilak here, Pisha president, and on this episode of 3Ps on a Pod, we will be discussing school-based advocacy at both the state and local levels with myself, Nicole Bilak, and with Christina Rojas from our schools committee. This episode is also available on our virtual learning platform for 0.1 ASHA CEUs or 1 professional development clock hour for Act 48 as well. In this episode today will be myself, Nicole Bilak. I am a full-time salaried employee with a local school district, Grove City Area School District, and I am the current Pisha president. When I'm finished talking about state-level advocacy, we will then hear from Christina Rojas, who is a full-time salaried employee at the Lancaster Area School District. She is also the LEA union president for Lancaster, and she is also a member of our schools committee. For our learning objectives today, we hope that you are able to describe the federal, state, and local policies and regulations that govern schools, analyze the difference between a caseload and a workload and help identify some data collection strategies that'll help you with advocacy, and then apply those advocacy tools to your own caseload. So public education within the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania is governed by 3 different sets of rules. The first one being federal guidelines. Your federal guidelines are going to be things like IDEA, Section 504, and the Americans with Disabilities Act, ADA. We also are governed by state law. Those PA regulations, such as Chapter 14 of the Special Education School Code, and guidance given to us by PDE, which is the Pennsylvania Department of Education, will also guide local decision making. And then after both state and federal guidelines are applied, everything else is left up to the LEA or your local school district. So that is governed by your school board in collaboration with your administration. When people think about speech-language pathologists in schools, they often picture therapy sessions. While therapy is certainly an important part of what we do, it represents only a small piece of a much larger professional role. This graphic highlights the many responsibilities school-based SLPs have and help explain why conversations about workload and staffing are so important. For the critical roles of education, first, school-based SLPs are educational professionals. Our primary responsibility is to help students access, participate in, and make progress in their general education programs. We address communication skills that affect academic achievement, social participation, literacy development, and overall school success. We serve students across all grade levels and support increasingly diverse student populations. We also help with assessment and intervention. Beyond providing direct therapy, SLPs conduct screenings, comprehensive evaluations, and reevaluations. We develop individual intervention plans, monitor student progress, collect and analyze data, adjust services for student outcomes, and et cetera. These activities require significant time and professional judgment, even when students are not physically sitting in front of us for those therapy sessions. The third area is collaboration, which is one of the most important and often least visible parts of our work. School-based SLPs work closely with teachers, special education teams, occupational therapists, physical therapists, psychologists, administrators, and families. We attend IEP meetings, consult with staff, coordinate services and help ensure that communication supports are integrated throughout that student's educational experience. Finally, school-based SLPs are service leaders and advocates. We advocate for student needs, educate families and staff, mentor future professionals, participate in professional development, support evidence-based practice, and ensure compliance with both those federal and state regulations. We also advocate for appropriate workloads and service delivery models that would allow students to achieve those high quality and benefit from those high quality services. So the most important message here is that school-based SLPs do way more than just providing therapy. We're evaluators, educators, collaborators, case managers, compliance specialists, leaders, and advocates. Understanding that full scope of responsibilities is critical when discussing staffing, caseloads, workloads, and workforce shortages. And as we move into our discussion today on caseload and workload, keep this graphic in mind. Every responsibility represented here takes time, and all of them are necessary to ensure students receive those services and supports that they need to be successful in school. So unfortunately, Pennsylvania is currently experiencing a pretty significant shortage of SLPs who are able to work in the schools. There's a number of reasons for that. First would be retention. We're burning out a lot of SLPs with high caseloads, and so we're having a hard time retaining good therapists for school-based services. We also have difficulty with recruitment. We don't have as many students going into programs or completing programs and hoping to go into the schools. And so not only are we not retaining, we're not recruiting. And so unfortunately, that has led to quite the workforce shortage in Pennsylvania, which is only just making caseload workload issues even worse. So let's talk a little bit about caseloads versus workloads. It's important to understand that Pennsylvania has a caseload cap of 65 students. Now, that sounds very finite and should clear up a lot of things, but it actually raises a lot more questions. How do we decide a caseload number? How do we interpret that? Are we talking about all the students we see? Are we talking about consults? What about the students that we just collaborate with? And then also, are we talking about all the students we're seeing? Are we talking about the case management students only? And so this interpretation being different for every LEA has actually caused a lot of discussion and a lot of inconsistency across the Commonwealth. So this is where advocacy really comes into play. We have met with the Pennsylvania Department of Education and asked for some clarification on this 65 caseload cap number. And so what we have been told, and this is the part you're probably not going to like, but according to school code, 65 caseload cap actually means 65 case managed students. So yes, that means you could have an infinite number of the students on your caseload that are not case managed by yourself. And so this is obviously a major concern for SLPs. Our students that typically aren't case managed by an SLP require significantly more time, more energy, more training, evidence-based practice, all of those things come into play. And so essentially, we can see 65 case managed students, but we could have an infinite number of students who are not case managed. And again, those are the students that really kind of take up more time, more of our workload issues. We've brought this concern to the Pennsylvania Department of Education, something that we've really been working on to see if we can get some clarification into the school code, because administrators do tend to just look at the number 65, divide that by the number of therapists that they need, and that's how they figure out staffing issues. And that's really not the case. However, I have been told directly by the Pennsylvania Department of Education that yes, 65 case manage is school code. However, and this is the really important part, make sure you write this down, that is only acceptable if you are able to provide a free and appropriate public education given that caseload. If you end up having 30 case managed students and 100 um, students that you're seeing as far as itinerant support or consult support or something like that, you need to be able to show and prove that you are not able to provide a free and appropriate public education, FAPE, with that particular caseload. So if you can do that to your LEA, then you are staying within school code. So the number is important, but it's also very important to prove that your workload is allowing you to provide a free and appropriate public education. That is just as important, if not more important, than that caseload number itself. And so this is going to take significant advocacy at the local level, making sure that you are able to prove that you can or cannot provide FAPE with a given caseload number. Both ASHA and PISHA have studied this issue significantly. And I think we have identified several reasons as to why we're having a difficult time keeping SLPs in school-based placements in Pennsylvania. Number one is burnout. Very large caseloads lead to high burnout and high turnover. We also have staffing shortages in other areas as well. Not only do we have less SLPs, but we also have less teachers, and therefore we're having to cover more, which is again leading to more burnout. We also have that excessive workload as more regulations come down from the state and federal levels. It just adds to our workload. And so it's getting to the point where we can't keep people in school-based placements. We also are working to protect student access and support that sustainable workload. It's a balance. We want to make sure everyone has access to the services they need. We also need to make sure our SLPs are able to provide adequate services within the time frame that they have. So what is PISHA doing about the caseload issues in Pennsylvania? Well, several things, and this is a multi-prong approach. If you're not new to advocacy, you know that advocacy takes many, many years with lots and lots of volunteer hours and data to be able to get things changed. The average bill takes several years to get passed, and that's if everything goes well. So unfortunately, we have some other things that are also kind of affecting us in getting things through. And I want to talk a little bit about what we've done and where we can go next together. So the first place that we've started with is with the Pennsylvania Department of Education, meeting with their administrative staff. And we've had several meetings. They've all been good meetings, but we have expressed concern to the people at the top that we have workload, caseload issues, and that we've got to do something to try and get more SLPs into the schools. PDE does acknowledge that this is a problem for us. They understand the workload versus caseload issue. And so some of their suggestions have been that we need to, number one, start educating lawmakers about workforce challenges and retention needs. It's very difficult to say, let's fix the caseload if we don't have a workforce shortage that can come in and help us with the caseload. And so number one, the first thing we need to do is make sure we have a good workforce ready to take on additional students if we're going to make changes to caseload workload laws. Also, PDE on their part has gone on to do more education of LEAs, administration, school board, those kind of things. So part of their training that they do for administration has been to educate a little bit more about SLPs, what we do, workload versus caseload, and talking about what a reasonable, manageable caseload can actually do for the school district. So that's something PDE has already started doing. They're starting to do that education piece. And then we have kind of agreed that we're going to really champion workforce issues. Some of the ways that we're doing that, we're going to talk about in a little bit, but things like the interstate compact, being able to go back and forth between certificates, helping with Act 48 conversions and things like that to help get people back into the schools are the ways that we're kind of helping with those workforce issues in the meantime. PISHA does continue to meet regularly with lawmakers to discuss possible changes in legislation for the school code. So just like when we met with PDE, we've met with Representative Pete Schweier, who is currently the chair of the Education Committee in the Pennsylvania House. He has also said that for us to be able to make any of these changes, we're going to have to show that we have the workforce to help us with this monumental task. So if we're going to try and lighten the load of SLPs, we need to have enough SLPs to help us lighten the load, or else we're going to make problems worse for ourselves. So that is what PISHA has really been focusing on right now, is making sure that we have the workforce so that we are able to make changes in school code. Some of the things that we've really been pushing is the legislation with the Interstate Compact, which should help us be able to get more SLPs in schools. We also have worked with PDE on creating that pathway between the ed specialists and the instructional one. That should help SLPs who want to go back and forth between the two be able to do that. Maybe an SLP that didn't go into the schools at first wants to be able to go back in. And so we have the Act 48 conversion program. We have lots of availability of Act 48 hours on our website, on our virtual learning paths, to make sure that we're giving both Act 48 and ASHA CEUs to make sure that SLPs in the Commonwealth have that ability to be able to get that teaching certification. To do this correctly, PISHA needs your help. Join the conversation on our new community platform and share your experiences and your stories as a school-based SLP. PISHA does look and read those submissions on the discussion boards, and we do provide those discussion comments and stories to local lawmakers. And we say, these are the things that we're seeing in the schools. This is a constituent in your particular area that they're having issues with this caseload or workload. And it's something that we do need to address. So by sharing your stories on our community platform, we're able to take those stories directly to the lawmakers who are responsible for the code change or anything else that could happen in the future to help us with this situation. We also have lots of ways to take action as well. On our Take Action site on our website, we have several muster campaigns that go out. Those are form letters that you can send within just a couple clicks to your representatives. We've been supporting IDEA full funding at the federal level. IDEA is only funded around 40% at the federal level right now, and that means your state has to make up the difference. And if your state can't fully make up the difference, your local LEA has to make up that difference. So it kind of all flows, unfortunately, downhill. And so if IDEA was fully funded, that would give more money to states. More states having money would be able to give that to the local LEAs, hire more people, and those kind of things. So we do have campaigns on our website for Take Action. You can send letters to your federal legislators. We also have several other programs that we've started within this last year. Number one being the Constituent Liaison Program. Sign up to be a constituent liaison. If we have an issue that pops up and your local legislator happens to be on a key committee, we might have you reach out and be able to make that contact for us. So it's minimal effort on your part as a member, but it's a huge impact for PISHA and the state. We also have the caregiver panel too. Please make sure that caregivers are on their parents, caregivers, patients. They are able to provide feedback on bills. We take them with us to Hill Day and they give stories to legislators. And it's important for not only us to show the effects on SLPs, but obviously what we do affects our students. It's, affects our families and caregivers. And so we need their feedback as well to be able to take that to legislators. So that's a look at what PISHA is doing at the state level. Now I'm going to hand this over to Christina Rojas, who's going to give you a lot of resources as to how you can take this information from the state and advocate at the local level to make sure that you are providing a free and appropriate public education to all of the students that you service.
Next, we're going to focus on school-based advocacy, influencing change within LEAs. Welcome. My name is Christina Rojas. I'm a school-based SLP in Lancaster, Pennsylvania, and a public ed setting. I do kindergarten through fifth, primarily with emotional support. I'm also a local union president, so I represent about 1,000 members in our district's union. This covers teachers, school psychs, nurses, social workers, and kind of all the professionals in between. So advocacy and local change is very important to me and definitely a passion. I have taken what we do best as SLPs for giving voices to kids, and I've translated that into compounding advocacy for students across the board, not just in my local as president, but in our region as newly elected vice president for a large region in Pennsylvania, and then also at the state and NEA level as well. I believe that SLPs are almost natural union advocates as well. But one of the things that I really want to focus on in this session is what advocacy looks like at the ground floor in your local education agency. We've already heard about the state level legislative advocacy and the PISHA tools and goals in a more broader sense. But what I'm going to do is bring this down at a more micro level at the building and district setting. And give you ideas on how to use data and your professional expertise to address concerns regarding caseload and workload, to influence service delivery models, and how to navigate decision-making structures within your local. My goal is that you're able to walk out of this with specific strategies, language that you can use in meetings and emails, and ready to adapt tools that you can plug into your own context as soon as you get back to school. I have three main objectives. The first is to identify the key challenges, understand the decision-making structures within your LEA, and then what advocacy strategies can you utilize to really be able to take home tools that you can turn around and utilize right away. So, the big thing, why does school-based advocacy matter? I think where we have to start is with framing the problem correctly. In many of our districts, student needs are increasing while staffing, SLP staffing is what I'm talking about specifically, stays flat or even shrinks because of burnout, resignations, retirements, and people not being able to fill those vacancies. What that means is our caseload numbers often don't reflect the true scope of our workload. Our evaluations, IEP meetings, MTSS or RTI participation, collaboration and consultative services, the documentation that we need to do for all the various programs and systems that our local might have, and also all of our compliance tasks are huge, and that's completely outside of the IEP writing, therapy provision, billing. So with all that, service delivery models can also lag behind current evidence and guidances. For example, heavy reliance on pull-out method, individual services, even when integrated, classroom-based focus delivery, consultative models. There's so many different ways we can go with this, and we have to be able to better fit for the students' needs, not the district's needs, or what they've always done versus what do our kids really need now. We have to be able to look at IDEA's emphasis on access to the general education curriculum, but making sure that that works. We can't just assume. It has to be individualized and tailor-made. And so when we have the perfect storm of all these things coming together, there's so many misalignments that persist. And students might not be receiving the right intensity or type of service they need. And there's just this ever pervasive SLP burnout. And that's why local advocacy in your building, in your union, in your district isn't optional. It's really how we uphold our ethical responsibilities and keep this work sustainable and meaningful for our kids. One of the things when we talk about with administrators, the caseload versus workload is lost on them. They often focus on the one number, caseload. You have 55 kids. That seems fine. Or you only have 45. Why are you asking for support? I know for some of you, you're kind of like, what is that? That's the dream. I have 120. But really, the reality of all of this is the workload. And that includes not only the direct treatment minutes, whether it's group, individual, whatever, but also the amount of time that you're doing evaluations, screening, that you're doing progress monitoring, that you're doing IEP development, that you are participating in MTSS meetings, that you're conducting parent communication, that you're collaborating with teachers, maybe not only for pragmatic language tasks, but maybe you're programming AAC and training the paraprofessionals in an MDS or AS classroom on how to better support that student when they're participating in morning meeting or whatever it is. But also the significant amount of time on documentation. A key advocacy move is to shift conversations from how many students that do you have to what does it actually look like to provide compliant evidence-based services to these students in this building under IDEA and state regulations. All of those things have to matter, not just a number. And that shift is where data becomes powerful. So one of the things that was really effective making change at my local, we were able to use data to shift and make that conversation come alive. We no longer talk about caseload now. Now we only talk about workload. We have a staffing model that's actually sustainable. But how that came about was by tracking data. We had to make our workload visible. And you need to kind of name those items and then track those pieces. So what we did and what I recommend is listing out every recurring category of work that you do in a typical week or month, including things that are often invisible to administrators. So those informal teacher consults, those AAC programming meetings and trainings with paras, the time spent writing reports at home, travel time between buildings if you're doing that. Also your building duties. If you are expected to do any kind of bus, loop, or dismissal or lunch duty, on top of, screenings, the actual SLP things. But once you define all these categories, you can then start to quantify them. Even within a 2-week snapshot, you can look at how many hours are you spent in each category. You can start to have meaningful conversations then about what they think your day looks like versus what it actually looks like. What they think 65 students on a caseload feels like versus the actual lift and the workload that would be associated with that. And it's less about perfection with these kind of time studies and tracking, and more about telling a very credible, concrete story about what the workload is. So once you have that data, it's really important to figure out who are the decision makers and where do I go with this data? So the first thing that you need to figure out are who are the stakeholders. At the local level, you might need to figure out who in my department wants to do this. I mean, if you're a fragmented SLP department, it's not going to get very far. You all have to be ready to kind of collaborate together and work together in a unified way to make this work. You want to see, hey, do you have a department head or an SLP lead? Because you don't want to necessarily make anyone feel undermined. You want to work together. You want to bring people in and figure out how can I do this work and get people on board with this. That also is really important to bring in your union leadership. I say this as an SLP who not only did this work for many years before I got into leadership, but also understanding the bigger picture. When you have a collective bargaining agreement, you can't have people doing individual bargaining. You have to bring in the association and make sure that you're working within the bigger picture of that CBA and also the working conditions that the whole association has to be able to get behind. So get involved. If you don't feel that you have a seat at the table, create one. I'm the example of how you do that. It is possible. But once you've kind of started there, you want to then bring in your principals, special ed coordinators. Start to build those allies. Get people to understand. Then you're going to work at the director of special ed level, pupil services level, superintendent, cabinet, school board. All of these people you're eventually going to speak to and advocate with to create real change, but it can't happen overnight. And you have to build those relationships first. That's what gets you not only a seat at the table, but a listening ear, because that's the key part. The relationships help bring along that change. And then the external considerations that have to come into this is IDEA, state regulations, and also budget constraints. But to advocate effectively, you really need to understand who has that decision-making power in your local. Um, you know, building principals and special ed coordinators might just control schedules, duty assignments, and how services are organized day to day. So there's a piece that they can support. But at the district level, the director of special ed and central office leaders are really the ones that make decisions about staffing ratios, program models, and how the district interprets IDEA and Pennsylvania's Chapter 14 regulations. The school board and superintendent are thinking about budgets, liability, overall district priorities. And you kind of have to figure out how to make all of that work with the union contract, defining workload and working conditions, and knowing which lever belongs to which level will really help you figure out how to navigate this advocacy journey strategically. So thinking about who do you need to influence? You really want to start once you see a structure and you kind of map out who you want to speak with. Who signs off on schedules? Who decides whether we get to hire another SLP or contract out for services? Who has the superintendent's ear? Who are your allies? You really want to make sure that you have general education teachers, special education teachers, school psychs, other related service personnel who share some of these same concerns about your workload and how that is or is not supporting kids through no fault of your own. It's just the design of the problem, right? So how can you get those stakeholders and influencers to be a part of this solution and share your concerns about service equity? Families and caregivers can also be powerful voices when they understand the connection. We want to make sure that we're also not throwing the district under the bus, because that's not going to get you anywhere. You can't complain to a parent about your caseload and then think the director of special ed is going to receive that well. It has to be collaborative, but also in a way that brings people in and not creates a liability problem too. But effective advocacy at the end of the day is not a solo act. You really need to build a coalition inside your building, inside your district, that will increase the pressure and credibility of your proposals, so that way people actually see the student-focused outcomes that will come as a result of it. But data is going to be your advocacy backbone. When you can say, here's how my 40-hour week is currently allocated, and you need to check your contract. It might be more like 35 or 36 hours. But here's where it's getting squeezed. And that moves the conversation out of the realm of opinion. The data is going to be undeniable, especially when you tie visuals to it. So you want to link your data directly to legal and educational outcomes. You want to talk about missed consult time or missed therapy time, because that is huge. Not only is that for billing, but it's out of compliance for IEPs. But the missed consult time with teachers means less support for general education teachers and really making LRE functional. Packed schedules increase the risk of non-compliance with those mandated minutes. Insufficient time for evaluations can delay identification and services. So you don't necessarily need fancy software to get this data. A simple spreadsheet that shows your weekly hours by category and the number of mandated minutes you need to do for direct services, and then all of the time that you're doing for those indirect services that other people outside of SLPs probably don't really understand or recognize. That, especially when you put it into a visual chart, is incredibly persuasive and especially when you frame it in terms of the student impact. I'm not able to give individual services to this child, or I'm not able to really get any kids dismissed because I'm not diving into therapy as deep as I need to. Those are real conversations that should happen that you shouldn't shy away from because it is student advocacy focused. So let's get a little bit more into what those advocacy strategies are. So the key takeaways from here are caseload versus workload, like getting that tracking template that you could utilize, advocacy meeting conversation guide, and then sample proposal language for service delivery changes. So let's start with how are you going to take this data? What you want to do as a part of your toolkit is to have a caseload workload kind of data tracking template. You want to think of it as a living document you can customize. The template could, obviously be adjusted, but you want to have columns for task category, time spent per week, how often the task occurs, and kind of tracking a little bit about constraints or compliance concerns. I recommend using it for an intensity of about 2 to 4 weeks to create a good snapshot and give you enough data. You want to highlight patterns like IEP meetings consistently push documentation into evenings, or travel time between meetings eats up about, travel time between buildings eats up about 4 hours per week. But once you fill it out, you'll have something to bring into conversations with administrators. Not just, I'm overwhelmed or I have too many kids on my caseload. That's the one thing I can tell you. Everyone at every level in education right now is burnout. So you saying you have too much to do, or you saying that your workload and to-do list just keeps growing, everyone's going to just kind of roll their eyes and say, yeah, me too. That's where the data comes in, and that's where having those allies and those key stakeholders, not only from the union, but from a compliance perspective in terms of special ed administrators and principals, is really important. The data has to be solid. So you want to kind of start with this spreadsheet, have your columns, really figure out what are all the things that I do. I mean, maybe that's where you start. Before you even get to the time study, you're going to think about, let me list out just for a week all the various indirect things that I do outside of actual therapy. And then that's going to help you figure out what do your categories need to look like. Figure out what is the 2 to 4 week snapshot that I want to do. Do I want to do this at the very beginning of the year? Do I want to do this right at the close of the first marking period, or maybe the start of the second marking period when all those referrals are now coming in from the first marking period? And really just kind of figure out what are the uncomfortable, I just see a typo in this presentation about the E kind of hanging. But how often are you missing lunch and missed therapy? Because those are huge things. I mean, your lunch is the law. You need to have 30 minutes of unencumbered lunch every day. But also, when you have timelines for IEPs and evals, a lot of times it is the therapy that gets bumped because you're getting pulled in so many different directions. And that's powerful data. The big thing is focusing on where is the student-facing time getting squeezed, and figuring out how to make that the priority. Also ensuring that you're getting a 30-minute lunch, that you're getting the prep time, because if you're in a public school in Pennsylvania, you have a CBA. There is teacher prep time in there. And in the eyes of the contract, you are a teacher when it comes to that. And you should be getting therapy time to be doing prep and to have, we don't get a curriculum. When are you planning therapy? How are you planning therapy? It's individualized. That time needs to be in your schedule. So here's just kind of an example of one of the things that my local did when we were tracking our indirect services. We were doing tally marks. So we printed this out, a couple sheets. We carried it around on a clipboard. We had a timer on our phones or on your watch or whatever it was. And we did tallies for all of these things. Now, this is outside of direct therapy. This is just for all these other things. We had done a separate time study on start to finish on how long an initial eval takes. So we did from the time, someone pulls you aside in the hallway, hey, I need you to kind of listen to so and so. There's something going on with them, to the time that you get the permission, get parents to sign it, do the evaluation, all those steps in between until a child actually counts as one on that caseload. Since admin love the numbers, we quantified how much work goes into getting them to be that one. And we figured out it's usually about 16 hours from the time someone pulls you aside to the time they are starting on your caseload with like an IEP written, therapy folder prepped, all that kind of stuff. Like you're ready to go for therapy for that student at one is 16 hours. So there's a lot of different time studies you can do to kind of quantify some of this. But this is just looking at some of those things that we just absorb that no one thinks about. Then this is actually my ASHA workload calculator. That's another great resource that I really recommend you utilize. But this was able to show, and I want to say this was, I think the date was cut off. I think it was like 2018, 2019 when we first did this. We enacted change a while ago here. But you can see that direct services actually only made up about a third of my week. 50% was in these kind of other things, individual initial evals, re-evals, documentation, all these other things. And so on average, my work week was supposed to be 35 hours, but you could see I was working closer to 50. So we were able to then kind of prove that we were constantly working over our contracted time to remain in compliance. We then came up with an agreement with the association, union support, to start getting set extra pay. We were submitting it. We had the documentation to prove it. That then has now evolved into an actual extra stipend for SLPs in our contract language. So not that that's all that this is about. We also have a 45-to-1 staffing ratio that we were able to utilize to make this work. That came about after years of time studies, collaboration. This isn't an overnight thing. This also came about with me getting more and more involved in advocacy. You can't get involved and think that you're just going to push forward SLP needs only. What do the school psychs need? What do OTs need? What do school nurses and social workers need? That's going to be kind of how you bring your coalition about too. And maybe you help other people come up with their own time studies, and then you guys collectively, with more people, it's going to make it easier to make change. So once you have the data, how do you have these conversations? So you really want to make sure that you're framing the conversations effectively. When you're speaking with administrators, how we frame the conversation, it matters just as much, if not more, than what we actually have to say. Because if we don't frame it right, they're not going to hear what we have to say. So instead of opening with, my caseload is too high, you might start with, I'm concerned with my current workload. It's becoming difficult to provide services at the intensity our students need and to stay fully compliant with IDEA and our IEPs. So this neutral descriptive language ties your concerns to compliance, to student-focused problems. You also want to make sure that you're tying things to district priorities, improved student outcomes, legal compliance, staff retention. That was one of the biggest things that we were able to do. We were able to talk about, from an HR perspective, how often are you guys having to post? How many hours do you guys spend recruiting SLPs and having to do interviews with the turnover? And by being able to say, hey, if you shift this model and you create an environment where people want to work, this is going to save you time. So that's kind of how you bring people into the conversation, is you speak to what are their pain points too. But the efficient use of resources is another really good thing. But what you want to do is really present yourself, your department, your group, as a partner looking for solutions, not as a complainer. There's enough of those, and that's not going to get you anywhere. You want to really frame this as, here's the data that I've collected. Can we look at this together and explore options? I have some solutions I'd love to share with you. But this approach will invite collaboration instead of triggering defensiveness, and positions you as a professional bringing evidence-based concerns to the table. I have an example for you on this slide. I'm sure many people can recognize it's the Scarborough reading rope. So it's basically all the skills that kids need to be able to be an efficient reader. A few years ago, my district had a theory of action. It was a district-wide approach to, hey, we really need to dive deep into reading. And we really need to get our kindergarten, first, second graders focused on reading, because data shows that by third grade, if they're not reading on grade level, the chances of them closing that gap and all the other impacts on success and academics just kind of really falls to the ground. So the theory of action was huge. By using this kind of rope, we were able to break down, hey, look at all these different threads that come into the reading rope that are tied to speech therapy. We were able to show that if we are given the ability to provide more meaningful therapy, more individual sessions, more intensive sessions at that kindergarten, first grade, second grade level, we'll be able to have a meaningful impact on those literacy skills, because we know oral language is the bridge to literacy. By educating our administrators on our value and what we can bring to the table and how we can support kids for a district priority, that opened the door to conversation. Okay, well, how would you guys do this? Well, in order for me to do this meaningfully, I need to have, I can't do that with 70 kids on my caseload. I can do it with 45. And this is what that would look like. So you have to give solutions that are actually meaningful for not just your workload, but the bigger picture. Another way to really frame conversations effectively is to ground it in advocacy, law, and guidance. So another powerful strategy is to have your advocacy focused on some kind of legal and regulatory language that your administrators are familiar with and that they regularly hear in their trainings. So, under IDEA, students are entitled to FAPE, a free and appropriate public education, in the least restrictive environment, with services tailored to their individual needs. PA's special education regulations add specific timelines and expectations for evaluations, IEPs, and service implementation. So when your workload prevents you from accessing and meeting those requirements, it makes it impossible to implement IEP services as written. And that's not just a staffing problem, that's a compliance risk. No one in special ed leadership, the cabinet, superintendent, HR, are going to want to kind of hear that. But once you bring the data and the visuals to show that you're not making this up, this is a real problem, and that you're trying to be proactive, it puts you on the side where we're working together on this. In conversations, you can say, given our obligations under IDEA in Chapter 14 and the data that I've collected about my current workload, we're concerned that we need to adjust either staffing, assignments, or service delivery to remain in full compliance and support student progress. So that's the language that's going to resonate. Also, too, to make the conversations effective, you want to not only identify a problem, but you want to give solutions that are actually going to work for you. Because otherwise, they're going to try to come up with the solutions, and another person solving an SLP's problem will just make more problems, right? So you have to be ready with what are some of the solutions. And rethinking service delivery models is a key part of that. So service delivery, you want to think about that as another major advocacy lever. Many of us work in systems that default to kind of the pull-out individual or small group therapy for nearly every student, regardless of age, needs, or goals. But we do have a broader menu. We want to think about classroom-based services that we could really support whole group. some type of co-teaching or consultative model. Not everyone needs to have those pull-out services, and really they're able to effectively utilize their goals when we're helping to train the teachers on what to look for or maybe how to prompt them. MTSS supports can sometimes be better when we align with educational relevant goals and allow us to reach more students effectively and proactively. But the key is to match the model to the student needs and not just tradition or what we've always done here. When you make proposals, you want to be prepared to think program level and systems based. So, for example, if you're going to pilot a classroom-based language block for, say, maybe a MDS or life skills or AS classroom, or for a certain grade level, you want to kind of shift certain goal types to a more consultative model. You want to propose, a time-limited pilot with clear data collection that you can make to make the change less intimidating to administrators and not make them feel that they're have forced into this. We want to bring solutions, bring pilot ideas and options so that they're willing to kind of explore this and be flexible with you. Overall, having a kind of a toolkit kind of meeting guide conversation plan is kind of what I was thinking with this. So you want to have a pre-meeting, kind of be ready. What are your goals? What are you doing beforehand to say, okay, if I walk out with X, this was a success. Bring your data and any relevant language from IDEA, state regulations, or district policy. That's the key one. District strategy, if they have every district probably has a strategic plan. What is the special education department's strategic plan? But during the meeting, you want to lead with student impact, use we language. How can we make sure? Things like that. Keep pulling the discussion back to the idea if it starts to drift. And afterwards, send a recap email. Thank you for meeting today. My understanding is that we agreed to, blah, blah, blah. And suggest a follow-up date. If you hit a wall or encounter significant pushback, know what is your escalation path, whether that's a special education director, your union, or a formal problem-solving process. You don't have to navigate this alone, and you should not navigate this alone. So here's some sample language that you can go through, and then you want to kind of adjust to make it work for your context. So when thinking about this, you want to make sure you have the right IDEA terms. So I'm not going to read this for you. But just an example would be, given our obligations under IDEA to provide FAPE in the least restrictive environment and to implement IEPs, I'm concerned that my current workload makes it difficult to do that consistently. Here's some data I've collected over the last month. Better if you have a whole group, but I know not all departments. I have, I think, 31 or 32 SLPs in our department. But I know some might have one or two. So you have to really make sure you have whatever group it is that everyone's on board. Now, once you have that data, how are you going to review that workload? So this would be a sample of maybe what you could say to your director of special ed once you kind of are ready to have that. And again, you can pause this as you need to. Here would be some sample language for proposing to pilot a service delivery change. This would be a sample email to the union president on how to have SLPs to feel more represented in the bargaining unit, because I recognize not everyone has an SLP as the union president, and sometimes people feel alienated. But the only thing I can say is you have to get involved. You have to be a part of the solution, not just complaining and saying, well, I don't get support. What are you doing to get involved? Maybe become a building rep, go to trainings. All of those things are available to you in your local. The more you understand the systems, the more you can then use it for your advocacy purposes. So how can we put this all together? So really going from data to change. Okay, so you're tracking that workload data. You're showing, hey, this is not working. I'm working 10 hours over contracted time. I'm not able to do my consults. I'm missing lunch. You then meet with union leadership, the special ed director, and you start pulling these levers strategically. You guys come up with some mutually agreed upon changes. You might adjust duties. Maybe you're not doing that. That was one of the first things that we did in my local. No SLPs were doing bus duty, lunch duty, or any extra duties anymore. That came out because it was like any extra time was for our billing. So it's little tweaks that you can start with. Um, and the next thing is set up a 3-month follow-up date to evaluate the effectiveness of that change and what are next steps. What do we still need to do? What's our next advocacy goal? So this is just kind of my thoughts that every time an SLP speaks up for a student, a colleague, or a system, that single voice becomes part of a chorus of small decision shifts, and policies start to bend. And over time, our everyday advocacy compounds into real lasting change. I promise you this is true because I've done it. I am evidence of this, and I just encourage you to join the the PISHA Schools Committee. Well, I mean, there's ASHA things too, but the PISHA Schools Committee, because this is one of the things that we're really talking about is how to make this work for school-based SLPs. So as we transition into the action planning and wrap-up portion of this whole thing we have going on here from PISHA, I'd invite you to choose one school-based advocacy move you're willing to make in the next month. Maybe it's using that workload template for, next year, figuring out all the steps and kind of prepping for it. Maybe it's drafting a proposal to adjust service delivery in just one grade level. Or maybe it's doing a pilot in one of the schools if you guys have a couple SLPs willing to kind of figure out how to make this work. Maybe it's creating a schedule to meet with a union leader, a key administrator, and using that conversation as kind of a guide on where you need to go next. But you want to pair with that one person in your local that you can talk to. You want to create an ally, find a decision maker, someone who will help pull some of those advocacy levers. Because that's the real step that you need to take to bring your ideas into action. And I hope all of this was just effective for you. Screenshot this or whatever it is, but step into what's uncomfortable. Don't be afraid to have some of those uncomfortable conversations because that's where change starts to happen. So I turn this back now so we connect with your school-based plan with the broader legislative toolkit and PISHA resources that you've seen today. Thank you.